back to our evening lecture series. We have a couple of quick announcements before beginning the lecture. First of all, the school catalog just came out. But actually, it's not really a catalog. It's meant to be, it doesn't document anything in an official way. It's more a manifesto, so it's like a combination. It's either a monologue or a catafesto. But this is it. And for all of you who stay for the lecture, you get free copies. So when the lecture's over, if you want one, it'll be out front. And also, we had a message from our friends at Fresh Meat this evening.
I just wanted to make a quick announcement in relation to the elsewhere call for entries that we're holding right now. We've extended the deadline to Wednesday this week, the 26th. We've got a pretty good jury put together, several members from Hendrick Blessing, so we urge you to submit your entries. You can check more out at www.freshmeatjournal.org. Basically, we're just looking for one photo from each person that kind of represents a change in your own thinking about architecture that kind of took place outside of school over summer break. So check that out and submit some photos. Thanks.
So tonight we are very happy to have John McMorrough back in the house. As many of you know, John is one of our very few disappointments at the school. And by that I mean that we wanted to get him here as a faculty member and it didn't work out at the time. But still, John is a very generous, frequent visitor. So in my mind, at least, he is in fact an honorary faculty member. So most of you don't need an introduction to John, which, as it turns out, is good because in reflecting on all the anecdotes I have, they're not exactly ready for prime time or fit for public consumption. But you know who he is already. For those of you who haven't been around or haven't as yet seen John, as you inevitably will over the next couple of years, last year he began as chair of architecture at the University of Michigan, where he's also an associate professor. Before Michigan, John was an associate professor at OSU, has recently taught at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and further back taught at Yale, MIT, and Northeastern. John received his B.Arch from the University of Kansas, his M.Arch from Harvard, where he contributed on the Harvard Guide to Shopping, and where he then continued on to do his Ph.D. During his Ph.D. studies, John also worked at AMO in Rotterdam and New York. In New York, John is also a registered architect, and since 2000, John has been founding partner of Studio Act, EPT. John is an active lecturer, critic, and panelist whose voice is in great demand all over the country and internationally, and whose writings have appeared in, among other places, Perspective, Punch, Constructs, Praxis, Volume, Case Issue on Toyo Ito, the aforementioned Harvard Project on the City, Harvard Guide to Shopping, as well as other magazines, catalogs, and monographs. I first met John at the beginning of his PhD studies. When he first described his dissertation, he suggested that it was going to be centered around the figure and thinking of Charles Jenks. I smiled politely and neglected to mention I thought that was a crazy idea. Fortunately, that didn't stop him from asking me to be on this committee, and the dissertation that resulted, which was called Signifying Practices, the Pretext of Postmodern Architecture. Over the last 12 years, of course, John's instincts, as usual, proved to be prescient, and maybe in particular for this school. UIC, of course, was in many ways ground zero for the first postmodernism, beginning its 3-year M.Arch program in the late 70s, in the immediate aftermath of the founding of Architecture Chicago 7, two of whose members, Tom Beebe and Stanley Tigerman, served as directors of the school from 1980 to 1993. In terms of the recent scholarship on this period, in addition to John's work, of course, we also have that of Sam Jacob, who's co-edited an issue of AD Radical Postmodernism that's just appeared, and who, unlike some others nearby, did agree to join our faculty. John. As well as the work of Penelope Dean, who's worked on the intersection of architecture design, circuit 1980, with Blessing commissions and other parts, as well as a range of recent studios from Paul Preisner's re-inhabiting of the early work of Peter Eisenman last year, and Aldo Rossi this year as part of the first year studio, the Topic Studios of Jeff Kipnis and Menace Live from last year, or the Topic Studio of Sam and Grant Gibson from this year, as well as many other studios at different levels in the school. I think you could say it does constitute a kind of collective, and this is borrowing Sam's term, reenactment of the 30-year-old history of postmodernism at the school and in the city. Style aside, the lesson of postmodernism for us attests to the highlighting of architecture's discursive potential, its polemical role, and its role in fashioning multiple and new audiences. And John's work is really central to that reorientation of architectures, to its cultural aspirations as it extrapolates an alternative history and an alternative future for an architecture of super graphics and color, or ruins and catastrophes, or humor and wit. In addition to the pleasure of being on John's dissertation committee, I also had the good fortune to teach with John at OSU, and I can say that John combines all of the characteristics you want in a colleague. He has great instincts for what's an interesting problem, very clever and economical formulations of how to set it up, and profound organization skills about what you should do step by step, which is to say that I did nothing for this course. I learned the most and did the least work of any course I've ever taught. Indeed, the interest that came from that first year at grad studio, I think, have certainly at least stayed with me in terms of the operations of coloring, copying, cutting, confining, and curating, which have motivated some of the things going on here. I should also say that John is incredibly impatient in all the best ways. In my memory, this isn't exactly true maybe, but as soon as we gave the color assignment, I came into school the next day before the students had produced anything, and John had rearranged all the books on a shelf according to color, which proved that designers and academics don't judge a book by its cover, but by its spine. And it looked great, and in fact, it turned out to be a really great way to remember where your books are, just remember the spot. So, in any case, please join me in welcoming back our prodigal virtual faculty member, John McMorrough.
First, I would like to say what a privilege it is to be asked to lecture here at UIC, a school with a faculty that I respect so much. The school, under the directorship of Bob, has had a profound influence on me, and I'm honored to be here tonight. To lecture in such a context, that is, to be the chair of one school lecturing at another, to me seems to imply something other than just a presentation of a specific work, but rather the need to make a wider statement, a declaration of an agenda of what we, being those in schools of architecture, find ourselves called to do, which I would say is nothing less than to rethink architecture in thought, in word, and most significantly in deed. That is, in the practice, in the world. In that light, tonight's talk is less a lecture, and more I would say a sermon, a homily on the articles of faith delivered to the believers as part of a renewal of mission and purpose. The talk itself is divided into 3 parts, 3 different significations of the blueprint. The first looks at the past, and the technical definition of the blueprint and its signification and representation both as a media and in language. The second part considers the idea of the blueprint as an original plan that influences subsequent practice and lays out the questions of agency and authorship that confront contemporary architecture. The final section considers the blueprint as a detailed plan of action and speaks about the future in schools and the way each needs each other to proceed. Begin. So here's the blueprint. What do we see? First, we have a plan. The plan of a building that does not properly exist, namely the home of the Jetsons from the cartoon of the same name. The plan comes from Mark Burnett's TV Sets, Fantasy Blueprints of Classic TV Homes from 1996. At one level, it's the depiction of a kind of retro futurism that I can get behind. The depiction of a lifestyle that combines technology, levity, and a luxury of space. At another level, we see a circular plan, a plan type that I would argue is the form par excellence of an organizational type. As a geometry, it is the one with the most minimal of definitions, a consistent radius around a point, and yet makes the most overt claims to hierarchy. In the context of the School of Architecture, the plan of the Jetsons' home also recalls another circle, that of the curriculum of the Bauhaus, that place it to the center of its attention, architecture or building, surrounded by the allied courses of materiality, technology, form, and theory. Of course, the most important aspect of this image is that it was a blueprint, but the image did not start as a blueprint. To make it into a blueprint required a bit of Photoshop trickery. The image as it was published and we scanned it looked like this, which is technically speaking not a blueprint, but rather a white print, a later development in architectural reprographics. The blueprint proper is an almost archaic pre-electrification process of reproduction. Here we can see the sunlight blueprint frame of 1876, where the copy is made by a photographic technique, much like a ray engraving. By exposing the original drawing to chemically modified paper, the imprint of the original is made. It is a relatively imprecise process, as the blueprints were subject to distortion, but it was also an indexical one, where the copy and the original were related by proximity. The blueprint evokes the plans drawn by hand, where the drawing forms the means of description. The project emerges by the coordination of individual efforts. The very idea of the coordinated plan, the description of a project, has become synonymous with the term blueprint. The term blueprint has a much wider application today. It refers not only to the defunct printing technology of the literal blueprint, and generically to the whole category of drawing reproduction technology. Now the term blueprint signifies the very act of plan making, or making a course of actions. For example, we speak about the blueprint for school reform, or the blueprint for success. Mark Wigley in his dissertation wrote about the relationship between architecture and philosophy, and therein he argued that philosophy was indebted to architecture for the metaphors of its generation. Think about the base and the superstructure of Marxism, or the very idea of the structure itself. These are first and foremost architectural ideas. So architecture is not based on philosophy. Philosophy is based on architecture. All right. I'm going to start over. This. Okay. Based on philosophy, philosophy based on architecture. Here I would add that the process is ongoing and continues. The migration of concepts from architecture-specific practice to wider modes of thinking about organization is one of the most significant contributions of architecture to culture, which leads us to another consideration of the blueprint. In this part of the lecture, I'd like to talk about this extended definition of the blueprint as a plan of action for advanced practices today, centering around the issues of how to frame the issues of organization and authorship. I think I start all of my lectures with this image. It's called The Architect's Dream by the artist Thomas Cole from 1840. And in it, I think, shows the kind of, it's the image of the architectural discipline itself. Here we can see the architect laying recumbent on a sort of massive capital, surrounded by the masterpiece of the discipline. Not only is he sitting on the capital, it's hard to see in this image, but he's also sitting on large tomes of architecture. I think this is a very optimistic image, an image of the capacities of the discipline to describe the world around itself. But I think today we're confronted with new sets of issues and new sets of concerns. That image to the right is one taken from an illustration for a video game, Fallout 3, from 2007. And here in the comparison of these two images that share a sort of perspectival relationship, I think we can also talk about the difference between what we could call a utopian model and an apocalyptic model. I think the utopian model is something that we can understand has underwritten the idea of architecture, the idea of some future condition, some future perfected condition to which we would aspire and hope to attain. I think when we look at utopia closely, we realize that the notion of utopia as we see it is actually a combination of two very different concepts. There's utopia with a U, which actually means the non-place. It's the place that doesn't exist. And then there's the homophone of utopia with an E, which means the good place. So with utopia, as we receive it, we have the non-existent good place to which we aspire. I think today, with concerns of ecology and economy, we're confronted not with a utopian potential, but with an apocalyptic crisis. And I think in this shifting from a utopian to apocalyptic mode, we have a new set of challenges for architecture. Not how architecture can envision the new good non-place, but how it can respond to immediate exigencies and immediate crises. I think with the utopian, as I said before, it's the non-place. I think the apocalyptic represents the every place. It's ubiquitous in its unavoidability. I also think in the shifting modes, we have a difference between what had been in architecture a logic of plenitude. We could think of architecture's history as underwritten by an excess. Too much time, too much attention, too much money, too much labor. And then architecture rises to fill the need of this excess. Whereas in the apocalyptic, we have a logic of scarcity. And so I think that one of the challenges facing architecture today is how can it reshift its conceptual legacy from the utopian to this apocalyptic mode. The question is, in addition to these new facts and these new challenges, how we posit the very act of the authority of our actions. Here we have the evil genius, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, from the Disney Channel's Phineas and Ferb, looming over the city with malevolent intent. In the critical perspective, the malevolence is not only a function of his intent, it resides in the very singularity of his agency. Much critical attention of the last 30 years has been devoted precisely to this anxiety of authority, with the effect of creating an atmosphere of escapism, escape from the professor, escape from proposition, escape from action. This flies in the very face of the definition of the architect, the man or woman with a plan, the generator of the blueprint. The question by what authority we make a plan, and here I would say authority, does not derive from genius, like the imagines, but from expertise. In fact, what used to be considered genius is actually expertise gained by a conscious effort. The author Malcolm Gladwell has recently written on this. He argues that the whole concept of David's talent is a myth, and he gives the example of the hockey protege Wayne Gretzky. And he illustrates that what makes Wayne Gretzky a great hockey player was the fact that when he was very young, at 2, was already watching the game, was already taking the broomstick and trying to recreate the plays in his living room. That it was initiated by a sense of interest, but then perfected through a logic of effort and repetition. In fact, Gladwell gives us a very easy formula. 10,000 hours of conscious effort devoted to a particular subject is the key to genius. I like this formula because it means it's realizable with effort. And I think it offers us a way of understanding our expertise as not God-given, but as something that we create for ourselves. On the subject of expertise and the exercise of it as a function to envision plans, Gladwell also wrote a recent essay, Small Change, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted, from the New Yorker last month. And in this, he's talking about the Arab Spring and how a lot of attention has been paid to the role of Facebook and Twitter in terms of organizing that condition. His argument is that a lot of that discussion was happening in America, commenting on that, and that the actual action itself was an embodied action that took a different kind of effort. And I think this is important because I think it speaks to the continual need for not only authorship and agency, but presence within these calls to action. I'd like to quote just a paragraph from that article. Quote, "There are many things, though, that networks don't do well. Car companies sensibly use networks to organize their hundreds of suppliers, but not to design their cars. No one believes that the articulation of a coherent design strategy is best handled by a sprawling leaderless organization. Because networks don't have centralized leadership structure and clear lines of authority. They have real difficulty reaching consensus and setting goals. They can't think strategically. They're chronically prone to conflict and error. How do you make difficult choices about tactics and strategy or philosophical direction when everyone has an equal say?" End quote. Again, I would say the authority of authorship stems precisely from this issue of expertise. To frame these issues of architectural agency and authorship and their expertise, I'm going to avail myself of 3 references tonight, all conveniently for the purposes of this talk published in Blueprint Books. The first of these blueprint books is Clement Greenberg's Art and Culture, Critical Essays from 1961, specifically the essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch from 1939. And in this, he lays out, in this opposition between kitsch, which he sees as a sort of mechanically reproduced culture, and in opposition, he lays out the project of the avant-garde. And the avant-garde proceeds through what he calls a superior consciousness of history. And I think this superior consciousness of history is very important in our quest to understand the authority of architectural expertise. But then the question is, how do we achieve this? How do we achieve this superior consciousness of history? So we can first look to Greenberg's example. Here we have Jackson Pollock's Lavender Mist of 1950. This is a painting that Greenberg refers to. I think I'm going to give you sort of the 10-second version of Pollock, or Greenberg's version of superior consciousness of history regarding painting, something he would later refer to as modernist painting. He says the superior consciousness of history that's influenced or that's made manifest by the avant-garde is done by a precise, almost Kantian critical understanding of the media at hand. And so for Greenberg, the media of painting is reducible to two components. It's reducible to the frame or its edge conditions, and it's reducible to its flatness. So that in Greenberg's sense, the development of avant-garde painting, or the development of painting itself, can be seen as a sequence of delaminations of false perspectival efforts into an increased attentiveness to the flatness and edge conditions of painting. So in Pollock, Greenberg sees a painting that, through its composition, addresses its edge condition, and through its compositional techniques, creates a space that in no way could be reducible to three-dimensionality or perspectival image. It shows evidence of its superior consciousness of history by its articulation of the media at the juncture it finds itself. I would compare this to another contemporary theorist or contemporary of Greenberg, that of Harold Rosenberg, who is also interested in Pollock. Whereas Greenberg was interested in the mediatic conception of painting, Rosenberg was interested in Pollock for a different set of issues. He was interested in the Pollock as the drip painter, in the physical embodiment of Pollock making the lines into the canvas on the floor, into the subjectivity implemented by the acts of painting. I think these are two very different models. I think the Greenberg model offers us much more to get a kind of understanding of how we might frame precise issues in this struggle to achieve architecture. As we look at architecture today, I think one of the ways we ground our expertise is through its research practices. I don't know if this was always the case, I don't think it is, but it feels like today that a lot of the effort to study and research architecture occurs not within architecture itself, but into its peripheral conditions through questions of geometry, the city, detail, and the history. And today I'd show four practices, or four projects, very recent projects that I think show how this is being, how this is happening in the field today. And so the first example here is referring to the notion of the city, and this is Nature City by Work AC. It's their entry to the MoMA Foreclosed Rehousing the American Dream exhibition, scheduled for the winter of 2012. And here, the idea is to relook at the American suburb, to question the prevalence of the single-family home, and to envision new means of having both the qualities of the suburb, but also greater forms of nature and density. I think for me the question, though, is the use of this is not only a specific meditation on the questions of the suburb, but in studies like that, in its confrontation with the city, projects like this start to demonstrate architecture's relationship not only to the city or to the suburb, but to the very notion of multiplicity itself. Or, for example, in this project, Jason Payne's recent exhibit at the Sire Gallery from the fall of 2011 entitled Rawhide, the New Shingle Style. Payne looks at the logic of detail and construction, takes the logic of the shingle, which is there to wick away water from the building envelope, and instead starts to entertain a different notion where distinctions in the shingles themselves could start to be elaborated by the reaction of the individual shingles differently to the water across the length of the building. I think there's more technical definitions one could have of this sort of interesting detail in construction, but I think in Payne's project we see a way in which the logic of detail itself, which in a way is the prevention of water seepage into the building, becomes a thematic to rethink the very way in which the detail itself operates in American architecture. Or this project, and you'll see a number of people from UIC. It's very weird to lecture about people sitting in the front row or back row, but I'll try nonetheless. And here we see the cover of the now published Architecture Design for September-October 2011, Radical Postmodernism, with the image of FAT's Fashion Architecture Taste, the Villa project in the Netherlands from 2008. And I think this is a project for me that represents the investigation of both history and culture. And I think it's an interesting project both in the sense that, in the way that FAT, as Bob has already mentioned, sort of re-looks at the legacy of postmodernism and tries to find within that material new possibilities, but also within the project itself, which was done in collaboration with the Dutch architecture history firm Crimson, and they worked very closely with the constituencies to try to understand not only their needs but their culture, and to try to find a way to make a project that was adequate to that. I consider this also a kind of research into the peripheral conditions of architecture to then re-envision the center itself. And finally, on the question of geometry and configurations. And here I'd say this represents the installation project, of which there are frankly too many examples, we'll just cite one. And it's the ubiquity of the installation project that I'd like to address, its possible significance, as well as alternatives that I'd like to address over the remainder of the talk. And to do this, I'm going to call on the second blueprint text, which is Theodore Adorno's aesthetic theory, in which he evokes the notion of, quote-unquote, exact imagination. And here I'll cite Sherry Weber Nicholson's succinct description of the term. Exact imagination. Adorno uses the term exact imagination to mark the conjunction of knowledge, subjective experience, and aesthetic form. Exact imagination is distinct from creative imagination, and thus describes a form of non-discursive rationality. According to Adorno, exact imagination discovers or produces truth by reconfiguring the material can. This knowledge is inseparable from the configurational form imagination gives it. How can we understand exact imagination architecturally? The vast breadth of problems which contemporary architecture must contend is vast to the point of being overwhelming. Amidst rapidly changing circumstances of economic and environmental upheavals, the discrepancy between architecture's means and ends, always a point of contention, now seem increasingly out of proportion. However, even in such challenging times, there's a certain concerns press themselves forward, not out of their exigency, but their inevitability. In form and content, these engagements appear incongruous, even absurd, in relation to what might be considered more urgent matters, but they are nonetheless questions that are both perennial and contemporary, reliably revisited at historic junctures. I've already gotten over the blueness of it. No, they weren't good. I figured it was part of the charm. Yeah, so anyway, there's these things that are revisited at various historic junctures in relation to contemporary circumstances. One such issue, widely reflected in recent architectural work, is that of arrangement. The apparently straightforward issue of how one thing goes next to another. As a system of component construction, architecture works on the relations between the elements that make up its totalities, its parts to its whole. The question of this relationship is no novelty. It is arguably an unavoidable and perhaps even constitutive issue of the discipline. The consideration of arrangement as it relates to contemporary formal projects, among many possible projects, allows for a meditation on the very possibility of architectural agency and control today. The ne plus ultra of arrangement is repetition. Rote, same after same, repetition, repetition, repetition. Repetition is the most basic form of arrangement, sets up an antagonistic relationship to happenstance, The image of Hilbersheimer's plan for central Berlin illustrates just such a relationship. Within recent memory, a great deal of effort has been placed on the avoidance of repetition in favor of life or its image as a model of design. Urban strategies that have dominated the disciplinary imagination in the post-Sandeum period of the last 50 years have also raised questions of how to evoke the city without resorting to the model of mechanical repetition. Vernacular typological variations, map urban deformations, collage cities, historical reconstructions have, each in their own way, attempted to avoid the mechanical and design of the city by way of appeal to a differentiation precipitated either by space, local context, or time, historical development. In recent years, the privileged form of working on the question has less been the scale of the city and increasingly more the diminished scale of the detail. In the development of a post-postmodern, post-collage sensibility, the emphasis in much advanced architectural production has been on the means of articulating particle relations that privilege continuity, both in scale from part of the whole, and laterally from part to part or whole to whole. The vanguard for this work has been in the area of digital fabrication, most occupied with a way to give an incremental deformation of a monomaterial cellular logic can give rise to an emergent field condition, usually as an installation exhibit of a wall or some other such architectural primitive. In the context of the issue of repetition, 4 projects and practices working in the shadow of the installation in para-architectural media, namely furniture, model, comic, and film, present specific iterations of larger tendencies in organization. The first project, Eames's Chaise, by Hernandez Alonso, deals with the issue of repetition by negating it and taking the form of the E-chaise lounge and performing a formal distortion to it, denying the repetition by variation and variability. In this project, the reference object becomes distorted to such a degree to render the Eames as a denial of repetition. Specifically, the biomorphic allusions to the recumbent lounging figure become monstrous distortions, resulting in non-anthropomorphic figuralities. I think this is similar from some of the work being done in product design. This is a set of barbells by the designer Philippe Stark that takes something that's inherently seen as something that's reproducible and repetitious, namely the barbell, and starts to make asymmetrical deformations to it as a kind of luxurious consumer object, while itself is, in the existence of the barbell, there's two functions. I think a similar logic is here at play. The second project, the Stadtziegel by Alex Lehner Sale, works on the issue of urban aggregation in a means specific to its medium, the contiguously spherical nature of the globe. The city is mapped onto the globe structure in such a spherical format that has neither beginning nor end. Interesting things happen in this combination of these two given forms of description. Of the city plan, which normally operates through two-dimensional projection, and the globe, more often employed in mapping large celestial bodies. The typical heterogeneous geological system of the globe becomes uniform cityscape, while the city, usually marked by the definition of center and periphery, now becomes an endless system, not only by its extension, but by its unfolding. So in each of these cases, I think there's in trying to articulate this concept of exact imagination, I offer a sort of parallel study to understand what I think is interesting going on in each of the works. And so in the case of the Stadtziegel, I would refer to something like this, which is an illustration of the cube Earth hypothesis, which was a figure in physics, of course an impossible figure, which gave scientists the sort of model to envision how gravitational forces would work on a non-spherical object. And so there's interesting studies of how the gravity would be more intense at the corners and you'd walk at 45, but it's the sort of fantastical, impossible nature of the conception itself nonetheless renders useful information about the potentials of organization. The third project is the Babel project from 2008 by Jimenez Live, Bureau of Spectacular, which uses the format of mega comics to envision a 12-kilometer tower for 87 million people, roughly the population of Germany, extruded from a plot of Central Park. Sectionally, zoning is established in relation to cloud conditions at various elevations. The envisioning of scales, which architecture becomes more than a building, more than a megastructure, more than a city, growing to an as-yet unimaginable scale, sets up the possibility for an imagination of unprecedented conditions of environment. And here, this is, I think, similar to what happens, this notion of this structure that could be built is similar to what happens in comic books. So comic books function under a logic of continuity, which means that there's a sort of narrative continuity that happens in all of the stories. But that gets boring sometimes. And so in the 70s, Marvel Comics came up with this what-if imprint, where they could explore stories that weren't part of comic continuity. So in this case, what if Spider-Man had 6 arms? So it gave them sort of pocket universes to explore alternate ideas of organization. And I think that's what Jimenez's work is doing. Each of these 3 projects offers something more than commentary, but less than instrumentality. They are vehicles for narratives of organization. These examples find agency not as activities preparatory to the act of building, but rather as explorations of the conceptual questions of architecture, exactly in the spirit of exact imagination. Another project which does this is the Office Moss and their film Romance of Systems. Formally, the film is a 10-minute film which consists of a tracking shot along the length of this building, in which you start to notice small distinctions of details of the chimneys and the windows and the shingles. There's a lot of shingles in this lecture, I now realize. And you sort of track it through a sort of slow attention. At the same time, as you can see along the bottom, there's a dialogue between this couple, both of whom are architects. One interested in subjectivity, the other interested in rationality. So that together the film becomes a way of not only exploring the form of the architecture, but the architecture's own discursive proclivities. And the film expresses the conceptual problematic of architecture today, but it does so in the specifics of a filmic medium, that of the tracking shot, where the camera follows the walking figure either on tracks or a dolly in a straight line. To frame the issue of arrangement, this operation requires conceptual qualification. And here I'll refer to the final blue text. Even the most rudimentary listing of strategies and theorizations, which have not been heretofore evoked to address things that do or do not go next to each other, would be nonetheless vast and would include such terms as symmetry, proportion, juxtaposition, superimposition, field condition. The list goes on and on. In recent tendencies, the arrangements invoke another possibility, that of the comic, as described by Henri Bergson's Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic of 1900. For Bergson, it is life's non-commensurate fit with the mechanical that is the source of the comic. And with it, laughter as the manifestation of the comic situation. A useful idea in that it deals exactly with this issue raised by the question of arrangement, namely the relationship between order and accident. Architecture is further implied by Bergson's model by 2 points. First, that laughter is specifically human. Man is the only animal capable of laughter, but he's also the source or object of laughter. There's no such thing as a comedy of nature not personified by human efforts. And secondly, it's difficult to laugh alone. It's much easier to laugh in a crowd, thus establishing laughter's social meaning. And here I'm going to change gears for just 1 second and play the video. So I'm supposed to do something here. I'm going to do something there. This is like a 5-minute video.
Бюджет трансформации сфера. одностороннюю. Можно к вам? Выезжайте, выезжайте! Отправка червя. Коэффициент распространения. Огонь!
So the architecture of life. The potential of such an approach is exemplified by the recent TCAUP film Einrad 2010 by Shangar. Which shows a Terminator-like robot operating a swarm, a la Agent Smith in the second Matrix movie, to generate a catalog of various architectural forms: the sphere, the wall, the column, and man himself. This film aptly summarizes the issue of how major figures, whole, can be composed of minor figures, parts, in a manner in which each is imaginable as a thing. Rather than use the variability of cellular elements to create an emergent formal logic, it uses the same over and over again, representing an apotheosis of the emergent cellular deformation model. The film is architectural in the way that the robot character is able, through its promulgation, to achieve these various form effects. And it relates to the interest in the fabrication project in that rather than variability at the cellular level to make emergent formal logics, there's instead an a priori formal logic constituted out of a series of elements that are all the same, yet their kinetic potential is able to transform. The example is preposterous, exceeding the realm of the possible, at least at this juncture, but it illustrates a new potential for arrangement through repetition. So here we have the example of the whole made of particular parts. the goofiness of the whole is built from the partial genericism of its parts. One aspect that this trajectory of work has avoided was not only avoided, but one could say was conceived and precisely defined an alternative to is an identification of the whole or the parts. Again, in reaction to the surface sensibility, the surface legibilities of postmodernism and its collage formalism. Here's another example, another Indian example, in fact, from an 18th century composite painting, which I think provides a better model for us today. At this juncture, the issue is to think yet again about parts and wholes, working between the ontologies of emergence and collage, and developing component systems that render parts as wholes. The proposition is as follows. The issues for architecture today can be addressed in terms of a compilation of the terms discussed. Architecture, using the organization of repetition to produce laughter. To extend the definition, when architecture, as a project, takes on issues that arise in the consideration of its organization, while acknowledging the impossibility of perfection, or at least the, at best, asymptotic relationship between means and ends, and engages them in the most potential form of repetition so as to invoke laughter, which after Bergson is a reaction of the fluid phenomena of life to external rigidity. It makes a virtue of its limits. Architecture then may neither be a problem nor an answer. It might just be funny. So then finally, a checklist or a blueprint for a contemporary historical avant-garde. This is for the students, I guess. Superior consciousness, exact imagination, laughter. Almost done. Third blueprint. Almost done. The final third of the talk, I'd like to consider the blueprint as a plan or a prototype, which includes subsequent design or practice. And in that way, talk specifically about architecture schools and their futures. And in that way, also touch on some of the disciplinary concerns previously alluded to. So what do we see here? There's, of course, the Rorschach blot, used as a diagnostic tool in Freudian analysis. The blot is made by a relatively simple technique. A blot of ink is placed on the center of a paper. The paper is folded in half and spread out to make a symmetrical figure, which in the logic of its creation has no representational value, but is a figure replete with suggestive qualities. What use we make of those suggestive qualities are our interest here. In Freudian analysis, these blots would be shown to patients. The patients would then be asked what the blots will look like to them. The point I would like to make about these blots is that the invitation to interpretation is not an evocation of subjectivity, but rather the answer to what it looks like is itself the revelation of a patient's condition. The response is an evocation of a pathology. The Rorschach is not an emblem of possible relativism, but the inevitability of categorization. Here we see another very different Rorschach. This is a painting by the artist Andy Warhol. In material, it's paint rather than ink. Dimensionally, it's much larger. It's 9 by 13 feet, and rather than being on a piece of paper. In the reorigination of the Rorschach, Warhol makes use of precisely the kind of specifically disciplinary effort, this, of course, in painting that I've been trying to evoke. The comprehension of the painting is made precisely from the quality previously invoked. This requires a superior consciousness of the medium painting to understand its process, and offers an exact imagination of the very problematic of repetition and origination. And I would say it evokes laughter at the condition of the blob's happenstance rendered in mechanical delineation. And this is where it becomes part of discussion of schools. So this was, of course, the perfect image for our own lecture series posted at the University of Michigan, where we are this term looking at questions of representation. And I think this is what my school, this school, good schools do, is that they frame issues of the discipline back to the school to engage both the field and the school itself on prescient issues of debate. And this brings us back to the questions of the installation. And under the heading of projects underway, I would include the University of Michigan's own work in this area. of installation. This is an area that's received a considerable amount of attention and funding under the deanship of Monica Constantino, formerly of Office Doc. And here you can see a project that she did with a number of faculty and students called Photoformance, an installation at the University of Michigan Museum of Art in 2011. As well, this genre of work has received attention in a research through making grant program. It's now in its 4th year, where 5 individuals or teams get grants of $20,000 to work on projects like this. This is Hair, Spikes, Cattails, and Turkey Foot by Vivian Lee, who was a winner of a 2011 Architecture Design R&D magazine. And so this is clearly something that's going on a lot in the school that I come from, the University of Michigan. But I also think the questions of what this sort of installation scale work mean and issues of repetition, as I've asked before, but also what the sort of pedagogic values, the historic values of this work are, I think are for me, maybe influenced by my local circumstance or question. And so this is a question we hope to address in January, where we have a conference on installation. We're going to try to look at not only its history, this is a genre of work that, depending on how you count it, is 10 years old or longer, and to try to think about what its effects are in terms of pedagogy, in terms of practice. We're at the point now where we have whole practices that are devoted specifically to this scale of work, and so I think it's a question. It's a question I'm critical of in a way, and I think this is another way that schools explore not only the production of the world around them, but become autocritical of the work themselves. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to make a few final remarks about the place of architecture schools. There are those who refer to architecture schools as islands, which I take to mean something along the lines of, we're all here, not going anywhere, so let's all endeavor to make the best of it. A la Gilligan's Island, I suppose, where we make coconut versions of our necessities. The image I prefer for schools is that of a ship. A ship, as well as an island, is a contained environment, in exactly the sense Michel Foucault's idea of the heterotopia, the other place where the typical rules of order are substituted with an alternative. That is what the school or the academy is, a place outside the world, another order, with its own set of freedoms and possibilities, as well as constraints and disciplines. As I have tried to outline in the talk, architecture is also a world unto itself, but as I have also tried to convince you, it is the world itself. Architecture and its schools are both representations of and the represented subject of organization itself. They are the blueprints of possibility. The other thing I like about the images of the ship is that it's in motion. The ship is going somewhere. It has a goal. Its motivations are opportunity. Its labor is underwritten with ambition to get someplace. The other thing I like about the idea of the ship is what it implies about its inhabitants. They're not permanent residents. They get on and off the ship. At school, students are there for a few years, the faculty longer, perhaps, but their permanence is also relative. Some are on the ship for their whole careers, others just long enough to reach the next port of call. This is to say the ship is not a home, the school is not a home. They are both conveyances, means to an end. We started the evening with one kind of retrofuturism, with the Jetsons' house, so let's end with another. To conclude my talk, I would like to quote from the mission statement of the Starship Enterprise from the original Star Trek series with a few adaptations. I think it fits the missions of school today. And in honor of Director Sommel, I will attempt to do this in a William Shatner accent. Space, or rather, architecture. The perpetual frontier. These are the ambitions of architecture and its schools, its mission to explore strange new worlds and to seek out and envision new life and new organizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before, again, again, and again. This, my friends, is the blueprint. Thank you. Exit space left?
While they're thinking of one, really, you're skeptical of the installation project, so how, you can say that here, but you can't say it.
Yeah. Is that a question?
Well, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think intentions in this talk. I'm not sure it all gel together. I think what I'm trying to get at in the middle part of the talk is, you know, we have this genre of work in the installation that's not something that I come to as a visitor. Like in my school, it's quite a big thing. I think also intellectually, a lot of people that I respect do versions of it. And so the middle part of the talk is trying to make sense of like, what are the things that happen in work that's architectural but not building? So how can we understand conceptual legacies coming out of projects that don't have implementability to them, but still do specific conceptual work as opposed to just making you think of it? And so this is where I think in the work that I showed, like in Alex's work or Jim's work, I think there's an organizational idea that gets mobilized, that causes one to think differently about the possibilities of organization, but aren't directly implementable. So that was a sort of side tour in getting to the installation project itself, which I think started off as a project to try to figure out new modalities of construction, but I think it's sort of hanging at a certain level where now the gallery seems the sufficient framework for the ambition. So the middle part was the kind of preparatory work, looking at work that isn't exactly installation, but doing things that are not precisely architectural, in preparation of now looking more specifically at the installation work itself. Because frankly, at this point, we have, like in our own faculty, we have people who are starting off careers at the scale of installation, who plan on staying there. And so I think an intellectual project at that juncture now needs to make certain claims about, is it a pedagogical project? If it's a pedagogical project, it's a pedagogical project in service of what? If it's a preparatory project, then it's a preparatory project in preparation of what kind of building modalities. And so I think I've ramped up my skepticism through looking at things that I found more favorable, then shift the attention to the other one. I also think that the point about looking at repetition qua repetition is that it sort of cuts the legs out of what I call the emergence project, which tries to mimic forms of life in its descriptions of its geometry, by going back to like the most basic rudimentary form of organization, which is repetition. And so in each of these projects, I think repetition itself was the thing that was conceptually powerful. And then so if there's so much power in that, then perhaps maybe the emergence, maybe so much doesn't emerge out of emergence. I don't know. I'm not there yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so how does Aeronautics chair fit into that then, which like follows some of the same ambitions of an installation project, but instead of just exhibiting an effort or a bigger ambition in smaller space, it's done to produce something?
Sure. I think it's a super fair question, and I was using it more as a kind of starting off the model of like one model of repetition where you repetition by denying its repetition. So the white and the black, basically by inverting everything, it's not an exact repetition. It was a sort of amuse bouche of the argument. Instead of like, here's one version of repetition where you don't actually repeat. Where the other ones, I think the repetition is much more relentless in a way. You know, one could look at his installation work and I think it wouldn't fall into these categories, but I think by taking that project out, I was trying to find something in that work that would set up these other projects. Maybe it's more rhetorical than conceptual.
Could you, just use your criteria against or the context of the installation project, meaning consciousness, precision, and flat? Let's say those are the criteria that you might say they have number 2, maybe not number 1, and certainly not number 3. Like what's
Yeah,
I'm wondering if do you think it's a problem of extreme specialization in the sense that, like, the legacy of those projects have become more and more sophisticated in terms of craftsmanship, execution, method of production, so that they become highly specialized the way carpentry used to be, or plumbing.
No, I think that's super fair, and I guess the questioning of the installation project is like the next project, so I'm sort of not there. I think I think you're right. Well, no, you're right. It's like extreme specialization, but like on the other hand, I don't think we want to get rid of specialization and intellectual divisions of labor, because I think that's what makes things get better, is through specific attention. And so that's like when I talk about architecture and these 4 modalities of research, I think that's one version of that. I mean, they all sort of come back into the project, but I think that's one way of parsing out the issue of architecture on its own terms seems less pressing within modes of practice today than some component of it, one of those 4 projects. And so I think for me, this is all preparatory work to the conference and trying to figure out. You know, I think the installation work, it's like super sophisticated along one vector of achievement. And the question, what would those other vectors of achievement be?
Like if you're, I mean, I really like your categories of super consciousness, history, exact imagination, laughter. And then earlier you talked about the shift from utopian to apocalyptic thinking, like, and this is not a trick question, but is the installation projects symptomatic of apocalyptic thinking?
No, I mean, I think that with apocalyptic, so the utopian and apocalyptic, I think is a kind of conceptual shift in a set of challenges. And so I think I maybe try to achieve too many things in the lecture, but what I'm trying to say is like, I'll grant that, but it's, I think there's these pressing concerns of economy, ecology, politics, sociality, all these things. But yet, I still believe in a disciplinary project. And so that's why these questions of repetition that don't address global warming, I think are still important. And so I don't want to disqualify a set of work because it's that. I think in some ways, yes, I think, you know, the installation project is one that's, you know, Tafuri used to talk about the boudoir as the home of the discipline. It seems firmly ensconced within the boudoir of the gallery and sort of sufficient unto itself. I still think there's work that happens there within it, so I don't want to disqualify it for that, but I don't think it's, for me, the apocalyptic utopian turn has to do with not jettisoning a disciplinary project, but trying to open up other concerns that would come about through logic of scarcity. So instead of there being too much time, money, and attention, there's not enough time, money, and attention through other means, and I think, I don't know, that's what I see this question of the overt repetition and these organization models that I talked about in the center. I think, in a way, although they don't overtly address like Mad Max scenarios, they try to address these issues in other ways. I don't know, I'm not unsatisfied with the answers that I've been able to formulate for the emergent material project in its installation form. And I think I've come about a roundabout way to try to now address. Okay. Thank you very much.